right. And for the judge's reference, I will be speaking on should iPhone usage be restricted for those under the age of 12? And for the judges, is it okay if I time myself as well for my own reference?
Mm-hmm.
All right, then I'll get started. Thank you very much. Let me just start my timer. Tall, dark, and handsome, 6'2"? No, not me, but my role model, Po the Kung Fu Panda. Okay, I know it's a little unorthodox, but trust me, I've learned everything from weight loss tips to Kung Fu moves, even the irreparable wisdom that it's possible to be discriminated against, even if you're Black, white, and Asian. But by far, the most important lesson that I've learned from Po is the importance of working with the tools that we are familiar with in order to get better at them. Because at the start of his journey, he was a mess with everything that he touched. But as he started practicing, getting used to different things, that's when he achieved true mastery. And this is analogous to our problem and question of the day. Should iPhone usage be restricted for those under the age of 12? And my answer is a sound, resounding no, for three main reasons. First is exposure. It's much more effective to let kids have that exposure and teach them the right way so that they don't get into issues later. Second, it's for contact, as they can use it as a method of safety and connection. And finally, as a tool for education. So first, let's start off with the exposure aspect, because let's be honest, we're in a world that is unnavigated territory. People have never had cell phones in previous generations, so this is a new problem that we must deal with and grapple with as a rising generation. However, simply taking the phones away from them because we fear that they're going to be using them wrong is the wrong approach. And we can see this through a case study called the DARE program. This is a program put forward by the federal agencies trying to stop children from drug use. And their simple method of doing so was never and stop doing drugs. And knowing teenagers, that approach worked as well as you can expect. Instead of lowering the drug rates, they actually rose because teens didn't know what they were doing. And instead of simply saying no, they were lost at what to do. So applying this principle to our cell phone issue, it's much better to give our kids social media and cell phones at a young age so they can familiarize themselves with the technology, knowing how to use it safely instead of going clueless into a world where they're going to have to use it anyways. But not only is this true in terms of exposure, but they use it as a tool for helpful content. Because think about it. Currently, we're stuck inside of our homes, so this isn't a huge issue. But as we go outside, it is a nefarious world with various hostile actors trying to trick people both online and offline. So in terms of the online world, again, it benefits children for them to have the exposure, learning how to navigate things like social media to not get tricked or phished or scammed. And on the converse side, in real life, it's extremely important as a tool for communication. Their first text can be with their parents. They can keep in touch with their grandparents across the ocean. And in addition to this can help parents make sure that their children are where they're supposed to be. And finally, the last point is not only exposure and safety, but education. I mean, in the past couple of months, I'm sure that you've noticed that we've all been stuck at homes and teachers have had to adapt their teaching to online styles. And along with this shift in technology is a shift in how children need to adapt to their learning. Now, technologically, we are never going to move backwards. We're only going to transition more and more onto a totally online platform of learning through various platforms ranging from Edmodo to Schoology to other grading systems. Thus, it makes sense for students and children to start getting this at a young age under 12. So they know how to navigate YouTube in order to watch the lectures that their teacher can't teach them in person, or study on their own in order to propel their scholastic journey all by themselves. Which brings me back to my question of the day. Should iPhone usage be restricted for those under the age of 12? And the answer is a resounding no for the three reasons that we've discussed today. First, exposure. It's beneficial for our children in order to try and have that experience working with phones so that they won't use it the wrong way, especially if the harming goes tough. And that leads us to our second point, that of safety. Online, they need to know how to access and interact with others in this cyberspace that they'll be working through in the next couple of years. And in person, it serves as a handy tool to talk with their families and relatives. And finally, we use it as an educational tool, A cell phone is a powerful thing with access to YouTube, classroom, grades, anything a student under the age of 12 might need and will use going forward. So overall, as we move forward, I might not be no Kung Fu master, but as the people of the world, the children under 12 get used to this evolving world, then they're going to need to adapt to this in every way conceivable. So to sum it up, no, children under 12 should not be restricted from doing so, because if they do, then they might just not get a kick out of it. Thank you.
Duck, cover, and hold. This was a famous mantra that I was taught since a middle schooler, that in the face of an earthquake, I must be able to duck under my desk, cover my body, and hold onto my table tightly to make sure that no dangerous objects hit me. But there's a new mantra that's been circulating recently. Run, hide, and fight. This is the three-word phrase that has been taught to us in the face of a mass shooting. That people should be running, hiding, and fighting in the worst case scenario. The reality of our country at the moment is that gun reform is needed more than ever. Mass shootings have become commonplace, and frequently we're seeing national headline after national headline of another mass shooting. So today, when we approach the question of how important is the Second Amendment, yes, the right to bear arms is essential to our country. But that doesn't mean that we don't need gun control and gun reform. Gun reform is critical to our country in order to stop these mass shootings. We can't allow this to happen anymore. So today, we're going to talk about the background and causes of mass shootings. Second, turning to an unlikely cause of mass shootings. And finally, turning to what we can do for gun reform while still upholding the Second Amendment. Well, mass shootings have become commonplace in America at this point. We've all heard about the mass shootings that have taken place in this year alone, including the FedEx shooting, the Colorado Boulder shooting, and as well as the hate crime-filled anti-Asian American shooting in the Atlanta area. This has devastated our nation, and in April of the 25th alone, there have been over 160 mass shootings in our country this year thus far. This is truly a national tragedy. But the causes of this are already known. There are four main causes that have been implicating our mass shooters to go this far. First, we see reaching a crisis point. Second, trauma. And third, access and availability to guns. We see that these three causes have been critical in causing mass shooting events. But in order to prevent them, we need to work towards gun control and gun reform. But something new that's been emerging recently in the news, media, and research has been called the contagion effect. Research done by the Violence Project, a nonprofit that furthers gun reform research, has found that there's sort of this contagious mass shooting effect. In essence, somebody who's vulnerable to being a mass shooter sees other people doing it and thereby actually copies this phenomenon. What we see from this contagion effect is that as mass shootings are becoming more and more sensationalized, more and more people are being implicated and being perpetrators of such heinous crimes. But it's not simply enough to just remove all mass shootings from national headlines. Of course, we need to bring these issues to the national stage so that they actually get proper awareness. So that's why gun control is so critical, which is why we must talk about the Second Amendment and gun reforms. Of course, the Second Amendment is crucial to our country. We need it so that Americans have their own personal security. But for the betterment and security of our country as a whole, we need gun reform. Now, many people are quick to point out that this infringes upon our Second Amendment rights, but not controlling the supply of guns in this country is infringing upon the national security of the nation, which is why we need two key reforms, at least in this country, which are currently being proposed by President Joe Biden. The first is eliminating and controlling ghost guns. Ghost guns are essentially the idea that people can buy supplies and kits from online in order to manufacture their own guns. Now, these guns aren't being tracked or regulated at all, which is a major problem, as people can turn pistols into more deadly rifles. The second piece of legislation that I also propose is the red flag law. This law, in essence, states that anybody who is capable of doing a mass shooting, somebody who has mental health problems, and who has a vulnerability to becoming a mass shooter can get a court mandate from either a police officer or a family member to make sure that they're not bearing arms because they're posing a threat to themselves and to the people around them. So today, we've answered the question, how important is the Second Amendment? Yes, it is crucial to the survival of America as a whole. However, we still do need gun control. We first took a look at why we need gun control through the main causes of mass shooting events. Secondly, through the contagion effect and how as mass shootings continue to be sensationalized, they continue to become more and more widespread. And finally, we need gun control and gun reform through the red flag law and by regulating ghost guns. So when we hear the mantra, run, hide, and fight, nobody should be in fear of this any longer. Mass shootings need to stop now. Thank you.
I have chosen how can we stop bullying in our schools. Is everyone ready? Great. Then I will begin right now. One might ask, was it embarrassing being the only guy on an all-girls high school dance team? A little. Was it fun to leave classes early so you could go prepare for pep rallies? A little. Was the tutu uncomfortable? A little. But in all seriousness, for the last 2 years, I have competed on my high school dance team where I am the only boy. And being at a 2,000 kid public high school, it goes over about as well as you'd expect. And when I was a sophomore in high school, whenever a group of guys would tease me about being on an all-girls dance team, I would fight back. I would attack them and say, no, that's not true. I'm not like that. That's not who I am. But they would just get stronger and attack and bully me more. And unfortunately, this is what we've taught kids throughout elementary, middle, and high school across the country. We are teaching kids right now that in order to prevent bullying, you need to stand up for yourself and fight back. But I would submit to you that there is a much more effective approach. In the last year, when people started attacking me for being on a high school dance team and making jokes, I would just say, yeah, I am on a high school dance team. I am just surrounded by a bunch of girls, and I am the only boy. And I think that's kind of cool. Instead of fighting back and saying why they were wrong or why they were stupid, I simply owned what they were attacking me for, and that left them with nothing. So today, we are going to explore this question further. How can we stop bullying in our schools? By first looking at the current bullying implementations that we have in our schools, such as screenagers and stomp out bullying. Then look to the bad consequences this can have by looking at a national anti-bullying tour before finally looking to the Eminem movie 8 Mile for some solutions on how we can all stand up to bullying the right way. There's one man who goes across the country and tours giving anti-bullying speeches because he knows that the current approaches we are using are just not working. Like our first speaker mentioned with the DARE program, when governments try to implement things for teenagers to not do, usually it backfires. And Stomp Out Bullying and Screenager campaigns are no exception. When I was in 3rd grade, a man would come in and be like, if someone says something mean to you, you tell them that they're the mean ones. And it did not have any positive outcomes. Kids all around my grade would start standing up for themselves, but the bullies would just laugh harder, especially if they were older than them. They simply said that what the bullies were saying were wrong and that it wasn't true, but that just made the bullies' fire go larger. The alternative is to do what one man did across the country. What he would do is he would stand on stage and they would have a high school volunteer try to bully him for any insecurity. The way he looks, the way his hair is, how he walks, and the high school bully would just attack him and attack him and attack him. Then the man would stand there and be like, yeah, my hair is kind of funny. You're right, I do walk a little weird when I stand. And then the bully, after a couple minutes, would simply run out of things to say. The challenge was essentially, I'm not fueling your fire, so how long can it burn on its own? And as a consequence, these high school bullies who were adept at bullying kids all the time simply had nothing to say. And that's exactly the lesson we are also taught in the Eminem movie 8 Mile. Eminem's main protagonist in the movie is called B-Rabbit, and after choking and losing several rap battles earlier in the movie, he comes to the final stage. The stakes are almost as high as a state high school impromptu round, so it's a pretty big deal. He goes on stage, and when he goes first, he starts by listing all his own flaws. He talks about all the ways in which he falls short, all the ways he isn't up to par. And what does that do? that leaves his opponent with nothing. So his opponent, who had been knocking out people in rap battles all year, had nothing to say, and Eminem's character, B-Rabbit, was victorious. Today, we are constantly confronted with bullying everywhere, sometimes horrendous, but the solution we've been spoon-fed since kindergarten is simply not the answer. If we just tell kids, fight back and essentially be a bully to the bully, you can't fight fire with fire, it's only going to get worse. We looked at that by examining the Screenagers and Stomp Out Bullying campaign. Then we turned to the man who's putting a stop to bullying with his national tours before finally looking to the Eminem movie 8 Mile on how we can all stand up to bullying. So now that I am on a high school team where I am the only boy, I've learned how to embrace it and be proud of it, which has left no bullies left to attack me because I'm not insecure and I'm proud of what I'm doing. So the next time you find yourself trying to be a bully to a bully, be the bigger person. That way we can all end school bullying for good. Thank you.
Are all my judges ready? Are we a racist nation? This is a surprisingly loaded question, considering we live in a country that is often referred to as the melting pot. To America, minorities of all shapes and sizes can immigrate from their countries, like my parents, to seek a better future and finally achieve success. So to the question, are we a racist nation? I'd like to say no, but in the end, we must acknowledge that the scaffolding of our nation was built under prejudice and injustice. We need to find out that our history is rooted in a lot of hatred. So today, let us examine 3 different racial groups across history: African Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans, and see how the hatred and prejudice they faced shaped the foundation of our nation and affects every one of us on a systemic level. So first, let's take a look at Black history. This is a vast situation of injustice where from the 1600s, African Americans were being forced onto ships and sent to the United States to toil under scourge and lash for absolutely no pay under the system known as enslavement. But even after the Emancipation Proclamation was written and passed, African Americans still faced so much racism in society. The worst of this was perpetuated by state governments themselves. You see, in the 1890s, disenfranchisement measures were taken up by states in the South. Due to this, incredible amounts of Black voters were stopped from going to the voting booths and make their voices heard under threat of physical intimidation and even legislative measures like literacy tests, which were disproportionately geared to fail African Americans, and poll taxes that newly emancipated individuals could not pay. Furthermore, the federal government did not afford any of these newly emancipated individuals any provisions. So they were essentially turned out onto the street with nowhere to live, no food to buy, not even the clothes on their backs. Although this seems like this happened 100 years ago, we can still feel the reverberations of this injustice sounding today in our own society. You see, the Georgia voter suppression bills are often dubbed Jim Crow 2.0 because they draw a lot from the earlier voter suppression acts that were passed in the 1890s. Furthermore, the disproportionate poverty line of African Americans is mainly due to the fact that after they were emancipated, they were afforded absolutely nothing from the federal government. Meanwhile, white people were allowed to generate generational wealth over the history, and they were never robbed of all of their provisions the way African Americans were under slavery. With that in mind, let's next move on to Native Americans, the first people who lived on this land and yet who were terribly and devastatingly genocided for the most part, and who faced slander in the media and stereotypes. You see, the Native Americans were mainly rounded up under this piece of legislation called the Dawes Severalty Act with the Curtis Amendment. What this said was essentially any Native American who assimilated could be granted US citizenship and voting rights. But if they refused to go to Christian schools and adopt a Christian name, they would essentially be forced to march further on the Trail of Tears, a path where hundreds of thousands of Cherokee Americans died. Now, again, this happened nearly 100 to 200 years ago, but these ideals of assimilation, where immigrants are expected to come to the United States and essentially adopt American culture while forsaking their own, is essentially a way that the Dawes Severalty Act is still enforced in a smaller capacity. You see, this thing like a hyphenated American, someone who moved from another country, is not supposed to exist under the legislation Teddy Roosevelt signed into office just a couple years ago. You see, this expectation of assimilation is so incredibly harmful and still affects all of us today. Finally, let's look at the Immigration Exclusion Acts that Asian Americans had to face. This is simple. They were essentially not allowed to come to the United States and live out their dream under the expectation that they would be dirty and unclean. Thus, they were forced from the United States in droves. So today, when we examine, are we a racist nation, we need to acknowledge our racist past that still affects all of us on a systemic level today. And although it's hard to say my homeland is racist, we need to acknowledge this to make any progress in the future. Thank you.
Great. In April of last year, my friends and I were extremely excited when our school suddenly announced an extended 2-week spring break. And a year later, let's just say that we were extremely wrong. Because not only does the COVID-19 pandemic lasted much longer than we've ever thought it would, but it has also drastically affected the mode of learning students across America are learning from. In fact, these days, I haven't been going to classes. And just like students all around America, we're tuning into Zoom to learn English, history, and math. But especially considering the effects of online learning that it has had on teachers and students, we have to ask today's question. How effective is online learning? And the answer is that it's not very effective at all because of 3 key reasons. First, students are learning less and aren't as engaged. Second, there's huge inequality in access to online learning. Before finally discussing how we can make online learning more effective than it is right now. Now, if it's pretty clear from how many times I've fallen asleep on Zoom calls, that students just aren't as engaged when it comes to online learning. And it's pretty clear why. Multiple academic studies have confirmed that when learning from an online environment like over Zoom, students are not only more distracted in their homes, but also feel less connected to their students and their teachers. In fact, how many times have I heard my teacher talk to a silent room over Zoom while no one responds and is on their phone during class? And it's not just engagement that has taken a hit, because students are also learning less in general, with schools around the world having to slow down their pace of learning and teach students less material simply because it's harder to convey information over an online environment. And because of that, we can see from this first point that students are learning less and are not as engaged, that online learning simply isn't effective at all. But next, a second and possibly more important reason why online learning isn't effective is because there is a huge disparity in inequality to access. In fact, right now, the US Census Bureau found in 2020 that 9 million children across the United States simply don't have access to the internet, completely preventing them from even going to online school in the first place. And that's the reason why, as of now, 90% of middle and high-income students are attending online learning, while only 60% of low-income students are attending online classes, because they simply don't have access to the same technology, internet, or even the same resources that their more wealthy counterparts have access to. Because we're all extremely lucky getting to do a speech and debate tournament through a Zoom call, but other children across the world don't even have access to internet in the first place, and that is completely preventing them from engaging in online learning. And this also has massive economic impacts, with many academic studies finding that the loss in learning caused by online learning will actually cause a $9 million loss in GDP over the next few years, showing us again how online learning has its shortcomings, especially being inequality in access. So finally, let's take a more optimistic approach to this problem, because it's not all bad, and there are definitely steps we can take to making online learning even more effective than it is now. The first way we can do this is by increasing internet access across the nation. And President Biden has already proposed this in his new infrastructure plan, where he plans to spend billions of dollars on increasing broadband access around the country. But he can go even further, because not only by increasing internet access, by increasing access to computers, tablets, and technology, we can make online learning more equitable for everyone. But it's also hybrid modes of education, just like my school is doing right now as the coronavirus pandemic starts to close up. Hopefully, then students can start going to school again with a hybrid mode of education, where it's half online and half in person, thereby eliminating the huge negative impacts of online learning by combining it with the best aspects of in-person learning. So today, we answer the question, how effective is online learning? By answering, not very effective. Because first, students are learning less and aren't as engaged. Next, there is a huge inequality in access to online learning. And finally, we discussed how we can solve this through increased internet and technology access and by moving into hybrid forms of education. So the next time my school announces a 2-week extended spring break, maybe I won't be so optimistic, because especially with the damages online learning has done to students across America, this is a problem we must be aware of. Thank you.
In preschool, we learned about the ABCs, the one that goes A, B, C, etc. But it's not just in preschool where we learn about how the alphabet has an effect on society, but also in economics, when we look at the different letter types of recoveries when it comes to economic crises. And specifically, we see now the K-shaped recovery. Essentially, with the letter K, you've got two legs, one going upwards and one going downwards. The one going downwards in society tends to be the one of those working as hospitality, tourism, and minimum wage workers, those whom often have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Whereas the one going up on the leg are the ones whom are incredibly rich businessmen and women, or those already having amassed great amounts of wealth. Unfortunately, we see that COVID-19 has unfortunately disproportionately impacted those lower income individuals, specifically minimum wage workers. And considering this disparity, it becomes imperative to ask ourselves today's question: should minimum wage be increased? And the answer is absolutely, because this is the only way that we can see that we are helping the most vulnerable in society. And we can look at this further in 3 key ways. First, by discussing how COVID-19 has put these jobs at immense risk. Second, by seeing how it disproportionately impacts minorities in society. And finally, by looking at a real-life example and interview of how minimum wage has been impacted amid this time. But the first way that we can understand why minimum wage work must be raised in terms of salary is by looking at the disproportionate impact that has occurred amid COVID-19. Back in around September, the Washington Post conducted an interview with many minimum wage workers in the United States, specifically those who originally took up a job that couldn't turn online. So when COVID-19 hit, they either had to quit their job and go for a minimum wage job or simply sit helpless awaiting stimulus. Specifically, many of those companies living in the urban areas, for example, tech companies like Apple and Intel, can simply switch to work online and they can conduct meetings online just as easily. But unfortunately, many of the minimum wage workers or those working in other industries have been impacted. And because of that, they need to turn to either other types of work. Now that they're out of work, they oftentimes have to go to minimum wage work. Yet, unfortunately, it seems that minimum wage work is not sustainable in the long term, specifically in a society today where we constantly seem to see increases in taxes and other situations. What we must see is that if we want to help the most vulnerable in society, specifically those who lost their job and had to turn to a minimum wage job, yet are suffering financially now, we have to increase minimum wage. But the second way that we can understand why we must increase minimum wage salary is because it disproportionately impacts minorities. Unfortunately, in America, generational inequality, disproportionately impacting the African American and Latinx community, has been in America's ground and soil since the very founding of our country. From environmental racism, where oil and gas corporations are disproportionately impacting minorities living in the region, to redlining, where in the 1930s, there were housing projects by the federal government that explicitly segregated those minorities. Unfortunately, to this day, many of them are still only holding on barely financially to minimum wage work. If we want to help the most vulnerable in our society, specifically lower income minorities that are racial minorities, that is, we need to raise minimum wage because they are the ones most often taking up minimum wage jobs. And if we want to progress together, it starts there. But finally, we can look at an interview conducted by USA Today last year, specifically interviewing a University of Washington student named Jemiah Williams, an African-American student whom is the first in her family to go to college. She explained that since day one of her life, she had already been set back between her wealthier counterparts. And that's because both her parents only had minimum wage jobs. And even when she went to college, she had to use financial aid or could risk her entire education. Unfortunately, in society, we often see this issue where since day one, many are already disproportionately impacted and set back because they're living in a cycle of generational inequality. Parents who work minimum wage can't get the kind of education that they desire. If we want to progress together as a society to ensure everyone gets equality in education, it starts by raising minimum wage to ensure those families can break out of that inequality cycle. So today, when given the question, should minimum wage be increased? The answer is absolutely, because in a time like right now, we need to be looking out for all of the most vulnerable in our society. First, by looking at how COVID-19 has specifically impacted this. Second, by seeing how it disproportionately impacts racial minorities. And finally, by looking at an individual story of Jemiah Williams, whom simply wants equality in education. So clearly, if we want to progress together as a society and ensure that those both legs of the K can go up together, it means we raise minimum wage to ensure equality in every aspect.
And for reference, my topic is what can be done to improve our educational system? Great, and I'll start my 5 minutes now. As a senior in high school, there has to be one question I dread the most, and that is, which college are you going to? You see, this is a question I get from family members, relatives, friends, and teachers. And I don't hate this question because I don't know about my college, but because senior year has been anything but straightforward for me. First of all, with online learning, education has been extremely turbulent and definitely not what I expected my senior year to be. Then with the college education system, my college results were extremely unpredictable. So when people ask me this question, it really begs the question, what can be done to improve our education system? You see, as education has become increasingly competitive in American society, we see that students are the ones to suffer, along with teachers, in secondary education, college education, and even in other forms of education. So what can be done to improve our education system? We'll first examine what we can improve in secondary high school education, then the college system, and finally, forms of education outside the traditional norms, such as trade schools and apprenticeships. But first, let's start by examining how exactly we can improve the secondary education system. In other words, K through 12. Now, K through 12 tends to be more straightforward than college, but it does have a lot of problems that students face. First of all, there's the great divide between public and private K through 12 schools. There's a huge divide in resources, especially divided by economic backgrounds. The fact that public schools may be under-resourced and underserved compared to private schools means that even from day one, students are already at a different playing field. The education system simply isn't equitable enough, starting with K through 12 secondary education. In addition to that, students tend to face many mental health issues within K through 12 systems, especially when they don't feel like they have enough support from teachers, and especially with the COVID-19 pandemic online learning. So we must improve these divides in secondary education by ensuring that public schools get enough funding from the government, that private school students don't simply have extreme advantages over secondary students. We also have to make sure that teachers get paid more, that they're able to devote enough time and attention to each student that deserves it. And finally, improving mental health resources within secondary education. But now let's improve our age. Let's see what happens when we go to the college education system and how we can improve postgraduate studies. Now, if K-12 wasn't already confusing enough, the college education system is even more disappointing. As a senior who just applied to college, the American college education system is extremely unpredictable. Especially with the COVID-19 pandemic and a large increase in applicants, college decision results have been anything but straightforward. In addition to this, the extreme cost of a college education is simply outrageous. The fact that students have to pay tens of thousands of dollars per year just to get a good college education once again highlights an economic divide in the American education system. So what can we as the government do? The government, of course, needs to increase the amount of scholarships and loans available to students, but also make sure that these loans don't have such high interest rates that once again, the economically disadvantaged aren't able to take away all the privileges of a college education. And by making the college application system more straightforward as well, we can make sure that we increase equity within the education system. But now, while we've covered the traditional areas of secondary and college education, one area of education that Americans tend to overlook are trade schools and apprenticeships. You see, college isn't the only path forward after high school. If anything, there's so many careers and professions that don't require a college degree. And where do you go if you don't want a college degree? The answer is often trade schools or apprenticeships. And unfortunately, in America, these resources aren't used enough. Across the world, especially in European countries, apprenticeships and trade schools are extremely common. And I propose that they should be just as common in the US. You see, not every professional worker in the US needs a college degree after all. Not everyone is trying to become a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, or engineer. Many of us just need trade school degrees or apprenticeships, and investing in these resources, investing in these additional pathways would make education much more accessible for students of all backgrounds, students with all types of interests. So, examining the problems with the secondary, college, and apprenticeship education system, we see that our American society has quite a bit of room for improvement when it comes to education. We need to increase teacher salaries, invest in mental health resources, provide funds, loans, and scholarships for college students, and increase our investment in apprenticeship and trade programs. Once we do, perhaps I'll no longer resent the question, where are you going to college? Because as a senior, the education system will become much more equitable, affordable, and accessible. Thank you.
Thank you. Judges, I got 512.
Yep, I got the same. Thank you.
Wow, tough round, you guys. What a great way to end. Congratulations, good luck, and thank you, judges, for staying so late. We really appreciate it.